Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Wu. I'm the director of the Fairbanks Center. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to the first lecture in our Critical Issues Confronting China series. This is, of course, a lecture series we hold most Wednesdays during the middle part of the semester, where we focus on an issue of critical importance facing either Chinese society or the People's Republic of China or anything which deals with how we should be thinking about and addressing China and both its internal and external relations. I have the pleasure today, of course, of welcoming and drawing our attention to one of the founders of this series, Professor Bill Hsiao. Professor Hsiao, if you want to just give a wave. Professor Hsiao, along with the late Professor Ezra Vogel, as well as Bill Overholt, are the three people who are the originators of this series. And over the years, they've brought to some of the leading China thinkers, not just here in the United States, but from around the world, including from China here to share their views with us. And we're delighted that we have another one of those here with us today, whom I'll introduce in a minute. But before I do so, I have a couple of logistical and administrative announcements that I want to make. The first is I want to extend a word of welcome, particularly to our students, and particularly to those who've joined us this year. I know that we've had a couple of events this fall, but this is really one of our showcase events. So I just want to extend a word of welcome to all the students who are here, as well as to all the visiting scholars and visiting fellows who are joining us at the Fairbanks Center for the first time this year, as well as for those of you who are joining from elsewhere around the university. And in particular for the students, I want to draw your attention to the fact that we have an initiative here at the Fairbanks Center called the Fairbanks Center Student Network. If you have not signed up for that, please do so. You'll find that on our webpage right at the beginning on the banner. There's a scroll for that. If you're still not sure how to find that, please do email fairbankscenter@fas.harvard.edu, and we're happy to get you that information. It's a simple QR code just to sign up. And what you'll get for that is invitations to various select events just for students, including, for example, the chance to have a lunch with some of the speakers in this series. So I just want to urge all of you who haven't joined up to please do that. So with that, I will finish all of my administrative announcements and actually turn to today's program. And I think we have an exciting program here today that's focused on Hong Kong, competing visions of a city's past, present, and future. And we're delighted to welcome today Professor Jeffrey Wasserstrom. Professor Wasserstrom, I think, does not require an introduction for many of you, but I will just highlight a couple of things from his many, many achievements. First of all, he is the Distinguished Professor of History at the University of California at Irvine, where he specializes not just in China and Hong Kong, but also in terms of what's happening throughout the Asia-Pacific region and drawing those trends together. We are proud to call him one of our own because for those of you who are students in the Regional Studies East Asia program, a special word of welcome to all of you because Professor Wasserstrom is a graduate of that program. And he then went on to receive his doctorate at the University of California at Berkeley, and then went on to a very, very distinguished career throughout in terms of, I won't go through all of those resumes, but he has served in various different capacities, including as an editor of the Journal of Asian Studies and as a advisory board member of the Hong Kong International Literary Festival. So just to give you a sense, right, both academic as well as mainstream, his writings have been focused and featured in publications from the New York Times to the Atlantic to Dissent Magazine to the LA Review of Books. But perhaps more recently, he has really been focused on the issue of protests, not just in Hong Kong, where he put forward a book soon after the 2019 events entitled Vigil, Hong Kong on the Brink, but also more recently on looking at what he's called, and I think what many other people have now picked up on this name, the Milk Tea Alliance, inside Asia's struggle against autocracy and Beijing. So looking at the pushback against autocracy by common everyday people throughout the Asia-Pacific region. And he has several other projects in the work, but one I want to draw your attention to is coming out next February, is one about China in the Xi Jinping era, which is entitled Everything You Wanted to Know About China, but We're Afraid to Ask. So we're delighted to have Professor Wasserstrom here today to share his views and analysis about what's happening here in Hong Kong. And I also want to introduce our moderator today, one more of our faculty members. Actually, I saw one other faculty member walk in while we're waiting. So I'll draw your attention also to Professor Reza Manella, also here in our history department. But I'm delighted to have with us today our discussant and moderator, who is Professor Moira Weigel. Professor Weigel is an assistant professor of comparative literature here at Harvard, as well as a faculty associate of the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. And her research, of course, focuses on transnational online marketplaces. And of course, those played a very important role, not just in terms of facilitating consumer purchases, but also facilitating the dissemination of ideas and coordination of logistics with regards to what Professor Wasserstrom will be discussing today. So with that, will you all please join me in welcoming Professor Wasserstrom back here at Harvard.
Thanks so much. That was really a lovely introduction, and I liked being introduced to who's in the room. And I do think it's a testament to what's special about speaking here, is that for those of you who are new to academia, there's a lot of talk about interdisciplinarity, but you often don't have as many people from as many disciplines in the same room. And so it's great to have literature and literary scholars and economists don't always show up at the same talk. So I'm delighted, and I like to think it's something about the topic, but it's also something about this place that's very special. And it fits that I was a regional studies East Asia. I was in the program here in part because I couldn't decide which discipline to go into. And it's a master's where you get to dabble, and you're encouraged to dabble. So I could do a little bit of religion, a little bit of history, a little bit of social sciences, and blend it all together. And I see in the room people whose work I've drawn on, and people I've edited or helped publish reviews of books by them at the Los Angeles Review of Books, where I co-edit the China section. So it's a great kind of connection of all there. And thank you again, Mara, for agreeing to do this. We've met but never shared a stage for any reason. So I've started a tradition because lots of things get recorded and people then watch them online, and something really scary happened to me ages ago, which doesn't have to do with the scary things about being recorded online that you may come to mind. But what happened was I had given a talk at Google, an Authors at Google event. I gave a book talk, and it was put up at a time, and not that much was put up online. And then I gave a talk a week later on the same book. And somebody came up to me and said, "I'm really looking forward to your talk because I just watched the video." And I thought, oh no, you know the jokes, you know what I'm going to say, you're going to be really bored. So any talk I give, I want to begin by saying something that is just about this talk here and this talk right now. And so I try to find something about the moment in time when the talk is taking place that has something that wouldn't be said at another point in time. So it's been really easy to do that today, because today is October 1st, National Day, the anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. And this is an important moment for thinking about how Hong Kong fits into the People's Republic of China and doesn't fit into it because of what happens, how that national holiday is marked or contested, or in the past has been a contested moment and now is just a celebrated, forced celebration moment, or partly forced and partly spontaneous. So October 1st is definitely a time to do this, and I actually have some images. Luckily, October 1st fell a little bit earlier in Asia than it did here, so I could find things online that were shots from that time and how it's going to be marked. Hong Kong Free Press, I didn't think about it until I just put them up. Hong Kong Free Press is a sign, the fact that it exists is a sign that Hong Kong still is not exactly like other cities within the People's Republic of China, because there is nothing quite like it in other cities of China, that it can cover certain things that would be taboo in other parts of China. It is under increased constraints about what it can cover, what it can run compared to what it could before, but it still can both, it can carry over in some ways a sense of difference. And I think that's one of the things that if we think about how Hong Kong has, particularly in the last few years, been moved toward being more like other cities in the People's Republic of China, the fact that Hong Kong Free Press exists is about a difference. On the other hand, the images that they showed of how National Day is being marked, this image here, there's a Hong Kong flag, but there are also mostly flags of the People's Republic of China. There's red everywhere in being marked it. There are all kinds of ways that the day is being marked that are supposed to flag, using that term in another sense, the fact that Hong Kong really is, that the one country part of one country, two systems is what stands out. The Hong Kong Free Press suggests that there is still something of a two systems. The joke in Hong Kong was in the 2010s that it was gone from one country, two systems, where many things were very different, to one country, 1.8 systems, 1.7 systems, 1.6. Now we're down to, I think, 1.1, 1.2. And about Harvard as a place, this being in this room, I've mentioned it's special because obviously of the people here, but I was thinking about giving the talk at Harvard. There were two things that came to mind. One is Harvard was the first place that I started studying protest. I didn't do a master's thesis, but I wrote the longest research paper I wrote was about Shanghai protests in 1925. I looked at Shanghai protests of exactly 100 years ago, and I'm going to be talking about how thinking about Shanghai as a place, as a center of protest, that then increasingly became a city within the People's Republic of China where things were done a little differently than any place else, the People's Republic of China, and then increasingly became less and less different from other places. So it's very fitting to be giving this the place that I first thought about the May 30th movement and thought about that event. And just to give you one sort of lead ahead of this, the May 30th movement features in all kinds of ways as an anti-imperialist movement, part of a nationwide movement, but it also within Shanghai, which is where it started, it was also partly about having people within the city getting to really control their own fate at a time when Shanghai was divided up into foreign-run sections and Chinese-run sections. And so one of the things that people talked about in their slogans, there were general slogans against anti-imperialism, against warlordism, but there was also Shanghai Renmin to Shanghai. Shanghai should be Shanghai of the Shanghainese. And there was a sense of kind of local pride and local identity, which was something of what the protests in Hong Kong as they were taking place in the 2010s was very resonant in that way. So I started thinking about parallels with Shanghai's past and Hong Kong's present when I was thinking about 1925, when I was following the protests in the 2010s in Hong Kong. And now I've been thinking increasingly about parallels between Shanghai's past in 1950, around then, as opposed to and Hong Kong's present now. The other reason why there's a kind of Harvard twist to this is I've been thinking about one concept to be in our minds as we think about the way these cities are moved by Beijing to become more in step with the rest of the country, is to think about, we can think about what that does for economic flows, for foreign businesses. There's an effort by Beijing to keep these cities different enough so they can be attractive to foreign businesses that might not go to other parts of the country. But another way to think about it, the Harvard way I would think, would be the idea of soft power. And I think both that there's a kind of national issue of soft power, of there are ways in which Beijing making policies toward Hong Kong has been trying to care about the global reputation of the PRC at a time, and that led to a soft touch being laid on Hong Kong at certain moments in its past, wanting to have things like one of the great soft power victories of the PRC was hosting the 2008 Olympics and impressing the world. That was also a moment, I think, when one country, two systems might have been the last time that a large number of people in Hong Kong, I thought, felt there was something that made sense about and was working about one country, two systems. Because one country, two systems, there are arguments about what exactly is that two systems part. Is it the legal system? Is it the press? Or is it just the economic system? But during the Olympics, the idea was people could take pride in the nation they were part of, the country they were part of, hosting the Olympic Games. And yet they could remain taking a special pride in their city. And what was done really brilliantly in 2008 with the Olympics was the equestrian events were held in Hong Kong. So there was a sense of we're recognizing the difference. And Hong Kong is actually, Deng Xiaoping had this famous line, I can't quote exactly, don't worry about Hong Kong after the transition, there'll still be dancing and the horses will still run. He was talking about the horse racing. These were kinds of the cultural things that made Hong Kong a different kind of place. So during the Olympics, there was a celebrating the nation, that was the main part of it, the country, but there was also a way you could celebrate the city and some of its traditions. And I think part of the story since the Olympics has been the collapsing of that. So I think thinking of soft power and different constraints on China with its greater economic and other power, less concern of some kinds of soft power. And I think with Hong Kong, there has been a squandering of soft power and a changing of some of the things. Hong Kong had a special economic role with the PRC after 1997, but it also had a special soft power role, which was partly when Hong Kong became part of the PRC, none of the universities in the PRC before that moment were widely recognized as genuinely top-tier global institutions. But once Hong Kong became part of the PRC, HKU and CUHK were seen as that. Over time, we've seen the prestige of Beida and Tsinghua rise, and that soft power differential of the Hong Kong institutions hasn't been as important as it was, but it has still retained some of that importance. So that's a way of thinking about how these change. So these images, I'm going to rush through a few images and then linger on the Shanghai and Hong Kong one. The Greater Bay Area is a concept that's been promoted in Hong Kong by the government in Hong Kong and by Beijing to think of Hong Kong as part of one unit with Shenzhen and other parts of the Pearl Delta. Think of it as a high-tech zone. Think of it like the Bay Area in the state that I am from, both by birth and by where I am now, to think of a counterpart between the Bay Area and this. And it's something that seemed originally quite artificial, but then it gradually became taking on other kinds of meanings. When I went to Hong Kong in the 2010s, at one point, I got a Greater Bay Area SIM card that would allow me to use the same phone when I crossed a border. And that kind of idea of connecting things into a region that spans. And it's one of many things where Beijing has thought about trying to use Hong Kong as a model for what could happen with Taiwan into a future, floating the idea that Taiwan could eventually have something like a one country, two systems idea. I think there are many people in Taiwan increasingly who are very skeptical about how that would work. But you see something like the Greater Bay Area happening when there are efforts to present Fujian and Taiwan as part of a kind of unified cultural sphere. Hong Kong over there, mega events. There's a lot of attention now to Hong Kong as a place that can host big international gatherings and star events, events that are a kind of soft power marker. Are you the kind of place that can have the most prestigious international conferences, but also international pop stars, celebrities will play there? Singapore is seen in that way as a place that Hong Kong is competing with for that. And Singapore is seen, I think, in some ways as having succeeded in doing some of the things that Beijing would like to have happen to Hong Kong, which is a control on certain kinds of political expression and political activity. You don't have demonstrations, but you do have Taylor Swift. Hong Kong does not yet have Taylor Swift. It would very much like to have Taylor Swift. But it is very proud of how many mega events are happening. And you think about the idea that having the ability to host mega events is one of the things that is a marker of global prestige. There's certain things that can happen in Beijing. Hong Kong would like to be able to have others as well. Here is the utopian vision of what it means when Hong Kong became integrated into the People's Republic of China. I do not say return to the People's Republic of China because it was not part of the People's Republic of China before at any point in the past. Until 1997, it became part of the People's Republic of China. It was not returned to China in any kind of meaningful sense. It also hadn't been part of the Republic of China. It had been part at the edge of the Qing Empire, but it was not given back to Manchus. It was given to a new country, a newly created country as of 1949, People's Republic of China. But the language of the official discourse of it, both in Beijing and by the Hong Kong government, is that this was a moment of reunion, of kind of a family being brought together. And it's not accidental that you have a woman with a child holding the flag as that kind of symbol, and the discussion of a motherland or a homeland. And so return to the motherland, usually would be actually Zuguo, ancestral patriline. But anyway, this is the utopian vision of what happened with the transition. And this is the more contested version of it. And these are images from other national days. In 2014, you had the umbrella movement. October 1st was a day during that series of protests. And then in 2019, you had a classic split screen moment where there were celebratory parades of the holiday in Beijing, and there were giant protests in Hong Kong that were still going on. And that day, October 1st, was the day that live ammunition was used by police the first time against protesters. Until then, it had been beanbag shot and rubber bullets. So it was a kind of defining moment. So in the past, you had National Day, at least in the 2010s, as this moment of competing commemorations. And now you only have one kind of event taking place publicly. There are other dates that used to have competing understandings, but now have a singular understanding. Important points in the Hong Kong political calendar. July 1st, the anniversary of the transition, the handover was a time for official celebrations of that moment and counter demonstrations of that moment. June 4th was a date when the big event was a commemoration of what had happened in Beijing on June 4th, 1989. And there wasn't really a kind of competing thing. But now, since the early 2020s, first in 2020, any gathering on that date was banned. And then now there are gatherings again, but they're officially put on carnivals and things that are not about the event. So that's in the one country, one toward one system one, the fact that you can no longer have that kind of gathering is a point in that favor. This is another kind of challenging the utopian view of Hong Kong's, all of its problems having been solved with 1997 as a kind of steady, rosy move toward kind of grand family reunion. There's the dystopian, and I won't linger on this, but in dystopia is very much on my mind. I'm now working on a book on Orwell and China, Orwell and Asia. You had, during the protests in 2014, an Orwell text, Animal Farm, was used by some of the protesters to say basically what happened when there was a transition from British colonial rule to this kind of reunion with the motherland was we just went to being oppressed by another group of individuals, which is one way of reading Animal Farm. During 2019, the Hunger Games dystopian vision was something that the young people on the streets took very seriously. That photograph was from my last trip to Hong Kong in December of 2019, where they have something from the Hollywood movie, The Hunger Games, about young people rising up against an authoritarian system. And spoiler alert, if you haven't seen it, they win. So it was something that meant a lot to the protesters. And this was from the umbrella movement, an idea a la the Animal Farm thing of now the chief executive was somebody whose name was a homonym for wolf. So they said, now we used to be ruled by British imperialists and now we're ruled by a wolf. And then continuing that in dystopian theme, in 2015, exactly 10 years ago, there was a film released called 10 Years, in which a series of filmmakers, an anthology film, imagined what Hong Kong might be like in this year, 2025. And they imagined very dark scenarios for the city then. And it was seen as both worrying, perhaps over the top, and increasingly as things have come, as it's reviewed now, people are talking about how many of the prophecies seem to have come true. But now I want to linger and then go into a dialogue form here. We're looking backwards to, I mentioned the 1925 protests, but I want to particularly say what happened after that. When the Chinese Communist Party took over Shanghai in 1949, and it became part of the People's Republic of China, there were many of the same kinds of discussions that have gone on actually ever since Hong Kong became part of the People's Republic of China, which is sort of what do you do with being a Communist Party-run country that has a city that's defined by cosmopolitan capitalism in different ways? How do you kind of square the circle of being able to keep it having some of its economic functions and also some of its attractiveness to certain kinds of global communities? How do you have international businesses feeling good about still operating there because you have a significant benefit from having them there while not having the things that you're trying to purge the country of by thinking of them as kind of polluting elements? And one thing that happened in the Shanghai case and has happened in the Hong Kong one is a kind of saturation with the symbols of Communist Party rule, of the color red is everywhere. For those of you who are coming out of kind of cultural studies or literary traditions or film, there was the film in the 1980s, Heshang, that talked about China having two kinds of traditions: the yellow tradition of a kind of heartland and tradition and Confucianism, and a blue tradition of connections to the wider world and kind of cosmopolitanism. So Hong Kong, it has been the leading kind of representative of that blue tradition staying on. But before that, Shanghai was. And many of the things that have been said about Hong Kong were said about Shanghai, a place where East meets West, the most cosmopolitan city in China, the setting for most of a disproportionate number of Hollywood films and other kind of center of the Chinese film industry, center of publications that you couldn't do in other places. All of that was true about Shanghai, old Shanghai. And then the question was, how do you bring it into the fold? So how do you take both places that are yellow or blue and make them predominantly red? Yomi Brayster has a really interesting book, Painting the City Red, which is about film and other representations of Shanghai that try to downplay the things that made it stand apart and make it part of this kind of national story. So I think you have these kinds of things, and Shanghai, the poster from 1963, it just says a festive day, but it's the kind of thing that would happen on National Day when you do this. And the flags are often put up precisely on the kinds of structures that would have represented foreign influence, international influence. In Shanghai's case, they also literally took over things so that buildings that had been about international businesses became things like a local development bank or government offices. So it's a kind of transforming the leaving the shell of the city in place, but transforming what's going on within it. But you're trying to have it, in both cases, in some ways, both ways. You like the fact that the city looks different and has this kind of cachet or global feel, but you don't want the things to actually happen there. A lot of the same debates went on by people who were in the city about what to do. Whether you should, one of the debates became whether you would stay or go, which has been something that people have been asking recently in Hong Kong, and that is a concern to Beijing because there are some people, like activists, who it's fine if they leave or are in prison or they don't become part of it, but you want businesses to stay, they want professors to stay at the universities and things like that. So just to give you a sense of how this kind of thing came about, in 1950, in the 1950s, you had, and this is from a memoir by Lin Pan, one of the most beautiful writers on Shanghai, and who died earlier this year. But before, she was born into Shanghai, old Shanghai. She left it, lived most of her life in other parts of Asia and in London. And then later in her life, she was back in Hong Kong and then moved to Shanghai when she felt Shanghai became a place that was more like what it had been. And she says, describing the time when the city was taken over, it was a Wednesday morning, May 25th, after token resistance by Kuomintang troops, that soldiers of the People's Liberation were spotted in the streets of Shanghai and white flags were glimpsed on buildings. At the Capitol, they were showing Hamlet with Laurence Olivier, and at the Grand, I Wonder Who's Kissing Her Now. To leave or not to leave, everywhere there was talk of this, of whether the communists were the very devil or a change for the better. Those who spoke of departure and starting life anew in Hong Kong or America spoke in hushed voices. Hushed because departure was at once like betrayal and surrender. Yet by no means everyone was seized by the impulse of flight. We have lived through so much, many shrugged. The worst has happened so many times. Can anything appear to us as new in life? Can anything appear as a surprise? If they were businessmen, they thought they might strike a bargain with the new masters. What didn't they know about striking bargains? They'd done this successfully enough with the Kuomintang, with the Japanese. Why shouldn't they be able to do the same with the communists? And I think one of the things that's kind of forgotten, if people kind of rush through, have a sort of Cold War view of what happened, you might have thought that as soon as China was under the rule of a communist party, people would realize there wasn't going to be a future for you if you were a missionary or if you were a business owner or if you were a journalist. But actually, a lot of people stayed. And there was something kind of like the Hong Kong Free Press. There were English language newspapers that continued to publish a bit differently certainly than they had before, not hard-hitting exposés necessarily of what was going on internally, but still had more of a kind of cosmopolitan view of the world and more of a discussion of the city than others. There were business people who stayed, and there were people who stayed quite a long time. If you read Life and Death in Shanghai, you have actually a life of, in many ways, somebody who was still enjoying what would be thought of as a bourgeois kind of lifestyle for more than 15 years after 1949. So we shouldn't expect, and I think we often expect, that there'll be a kind of instantaneousness about a change of systems, but it can actually happen quite gradually, and it depends very much what your specific kind of activity is. And not even just what institution you're in, but what you're doing within a particular institution. So I think recapturing that kind of open-endedness and the not being sure of what was going to happen and the gradualness in which people made the decision to leave or to go. I also want to guard against the fact that actually history does not tell us exactly where things are heading, that just because Shanghai got to a point where it now looks like you made completely the wrong bet if you were a free-thinking intellectual and you stayed in Shanghai. After that, that doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to prove the wrong bet to have made the other way. It's important to remember that open-endedness of that period around 1949 through 51. There were leading Chinese cosmopolitan liberal intellectuals in other parts of the world who went back to China to be part of the new China. Some of them, like Lao She, had a tragic ending out of that. Others, like Xiao Qian, who is a much less known figure. He's on my mind because he was the Chinese intellectual that Orwell knew best in 1940s London. He went back to China, ended up suffering during the Cultural Revolution, but then lived to be rehabilitated, and he and his wife could fulfill a long-term dream of translating Ulysses into Chinese and having it sell, which was surprising. So you have this, retaining that sense of open-endedness, but also realizing that many of the things that have happened in Hong Kong do seem to have fulfilled some parts of the prophecies of 10 years, including that you can't show a film like 10 years in Hong Kong anymore, a public showing of that, whereas when it first came out, streaming of it into the mainland would be blocked. There would be cutting things when it won awards on the mainland, but it could still openly be discussed in Hong Kong. But I'm going to leave these images of the painting the city red and linger that to think about whether Hong Kong has been painted red yet. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much for that talk. It was really interesting to hear after having talked to you a bit more conversationally about it. One thing I wanted to ask you about, is the microphone picking me up fine? Yes. There was a moment in your talk where you talked about the branding of the Greater Bay Area. And I think what you said was that it felt a bit forced or implausible to you at the beginning, and then it started to feel more plausible. And the example that you gave had to do with your SIM card and the fact that one can buy one of these roaming SIM cards so that you can still access Facebook across the border or something. I'm sure you were doing nobler things than that. But I was listening to you talk about that. I was also thinking, you brought up Joseph Nye and this question of soft power. And I have had many conversations in the past year with various people about soft power versus hard power, and specifically in the context of branding, because I'm working on marketplaces. But juxtaposing those two parts of your talk, I was thinking about this question of what kind of power is embodied in a SIM card or in certain kinds of platform technologies. Again, because my research area right now is these marketplaces, I've been thinking a lot about TikTok and Temu and these platforms that have now become very, very influential in many other parts of the world, though often as infrastructure more than as like content or a kind of representation, if that makes sense. But that's a long question, but I was curious to hear you talk more about the soft hard power distinction and how it works around these new technologies, how you think about it.
Yeah, and actually, I mean, I tend to, there's a Adam Gopnik piece I keep going back to in the New York Times, where New Yorker, where he said that whenever there are new technologies, there are basically three, you can divide responses to them into three, by analysts, into three categories. One is the never better. This is going to solve all our problems. The other is better never. It's really going to mess everything up. And the third is the ever was, which is a historian's thing that say, like, as new
academics do. That's what we do, right?
As new as all this is, that we've actually seen something like this. And I was thinking about it with the kind of Hong Kong as a different kind of media space, or the Greater Bay Area. The idea from the beginning was that Hong Kong in 1997 was going to become more part of the country. One optimistic thing was that actually, therefore, Hong Kong ways would flow into the rest of China. And in fact, with things at that point, the old formerly new technology was television and radio. And what happened was that people over the border in the kind of greater Canton area were being exposed to Hong Kong television shows that were doing different things. News could flow in, and there was a way in which there was the, for the optimists of this, the greater integration or this greater Bay Area before the term was a potentially positive thing because you could have that flow. Whereas now it's also about more kinds of control. I do think that one of the big issues to watch, which is why it really isn't one country, one system yet, is it's still different to use the internet in Hong Kong. And I haven't been back, but if I take a trip there, one of the first things I'll do is go online and see how different is it, because it's always been interesting when you move between the mainland and Hong Kong before 1997 and after 97 is sort of what is it that tells you you're in a different space? And the internet would be one. And if you don't mind the digression, I knew in 2019, I was spending part of June 4th in Hong Kong, and I knew that I could use the internet and find out all sorts of news and things that was blocked on the mainland. And then I went, and the newspapers also were also on the mainland. I went to Macau for part of the day because I wanted to see how Macau, which is also one country, two systems, but was more politically controlled and less problematic for Beijing. And I wanted to see how the newspapers in Macau were covering the event. Problem was I couldn't find a newspaper because I was in casinos and the areas, the pleasure courts where they hide anything. So it wasn't that you couldn't, not that the newspaper couldn't say things. It's that nobody was paying attention to the newspapers there. And so anyway, and I think Macau was a model for what I think Beijing wants Hong Kong to be, as a place that is different economically, but doesn't have, because of less interest, so they did have small protests and things, but it never created the same kind of problem. So how can you do something where, to go back to platforms, where people are just using the platforms for distracting entertainment and buying, which are things that can help the state, but not using them for these messy kinds of things. Mm-hmm. So anyway, that's a long-winded way.
It's really fascinating. I can't help but reassociate to the moment where all the American users were going on to Red Note at news of the TikTok ban, and how there was this brief moment of cross-cultural contact that folks probably remember last January, and then it got...
Well, we hoped it would lead to lots of people signing up for Chinese language courses, and it would save our enrollments.
Not yet. Yeah, I have to say I did a little bit of data scraping around that phenomenon, and it did peak very quickly and went down. Although an interesting observation to me was that, and I can't make a robust claim about this, but was that Red Note sort of scrambled to introduce English language features and translation very, very quickly. I remember people talking about China speed in relation to that, and it seemed that very quickly discouraged US and Chinese users interacting, actually making it easier for US Americans to find one another. But anyway, I was curious. I have a bunch of different questions I want to ask you. Again, to this question of soft power, you spoke a little bit in the talk, and we talked a little bit before in our emails about the importance of Hong Kong as a site for foreigners to visit, and the importance of having professors come to Hong Kong or Taylor Swift come to Hong Kong, in theory, and something like that. And I guess you've just spoken about technology and media in these border spaces or these liminal spaces. I'm curious if you think, just how you think about how it functions differently for foreigners as for domestic, citizens, and I don't know if you could elaborate a little bit on your thoughts about that vis-a-vis Hong Kong as a space that's important for attracting foreigners.
Yeah, so I think the internet's a good example of this, that this would be one of the obvious things that would happen if you're trying to have a globally circulating managerial class. Mm-hmm. I think about the global city idea. For Hong Kong to be a certain kind of global city, a global managerial class has to feel it's not a hardship post. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that, even though there are workarounds on mainland cities, you can use VPN, it's a pain. And the idea is that that's one of the things that Hong Kong wants to stay. Mm-hmm. There have been some international operations that have left Hong Kong quite soon after the national security law was imposed. in 2020. One set that is left is the Asia bureaus of some news organizations that have gone to Seoul or Taipei or Singapore, where there also are constraints, but people are used to them. I don't think that Beijing feels that's a great loss if the New York Times doesn't have its operation. That even might be a net gain. But they definitely want to have a kind of financial operations there. And one of the things that's interesting, since I mentioned that Lao She went back to China as he could have stayed in America. He was getting American readers and things like that. But one of the things he went back for a patriotic reason, but he also knew that he could get money sent from his publishers to a friend in Hong Kong who could then get the money sent to him on the mainland. So there was a kind of pragmatic way in which actually Hong Kong being that in-between space. And I'm not sure what that, for now, Hong Kong can stay for some of those things, that there are ways that for finances and certain legal things, it retains its difference. So there is it's this balancing act, and one country, two systems, it's clear that the agreement across the board is that it should be economically different. The challenge is what else goes along with that. And actually there's a sense that it should be legally different in sort of contractual ways that will make foreign businesses feel better, but not legally different in the way that would make it sort of protected for protests and things. And if you think about that, and I think this is something that is easier for Americans to understand in 2025 than it was in 2019, the biggest protests in Hong Kong were triggered by an extradition bill, which seemed on the surface like a quite kind of technical kind of thing. But the idea was that if there were legal things where you could be tried in the very different legal system on the mainland, and before the national security law, that was a totally different system, then this was a place to draw a line. So even if you say, like, is the legal system being different part of what the two systems that people agree, there it's a kind of breakdown. Yes, there should be different kinds of laws about property and contracts, but no, there shouldn't, from Beijing's point of view, no, there shouldn't be different kinds of laws. And many of these things had sort of Shanghai parallels. It wasn't yet a high Maoist stage where he said the factories should be run as much by the workers but they wanted to have managers stay. They wanted to have people with certain kinds of experience feel, and there was a time when Shanghai kept enough of the trappings of that people didn't leave.
I was curious, you shared, this switching gears a bit, you shared the images from the Hunger Games and the Orwell quote on one slide. In terms of the historical parallels you're drawing, are those parallels that some of the actors you're studying within these movements are drawing themselves explicitly? Or are there other kinds of historical moments they're looking back to as resources and warnings? If the 2025 film was proleptic or something, I'm trying to think about what the historical memory within the movement is.
Yeah, so what's happened particularly since 2019, the young activists in exile that I've talked to bring up Tibet as a parallel more often than with Shanghai and this is another thing to remember about, that in honor of Paul Cohen's wonderful work, another person who I met here who recently died, he talks about outcome blindness, that historians have to remember that people don't know what's going to happen next. And it matters when the story ends, that there was an early period in the early 1950s when it looked like the Dalai Lama was going to work out a modus vivendi with Beijing. And there was an idea that maybe Tibet could continue to be, they didn't exactly use one country's systems, they had something very similar to that. And the idea would be a different place, but not too different, and then that doesn't work. And this is why some people will now, there's an interest in that kind of moment. And I mentioned the Beijing Olympics, and this is an example. I've had young Hong Kongers who were very young in 2008 remember being very excited about the Olympics. And that was a time when there were calls for a boycott by Tibetans in exile, and it seemed to disconnect. And then there becomes okay, maybe we should learn more about that moment. So that's one of the historical analogies that people used to, and it's not brand new. There were some Hong Kong intellectuals in the 1980s who said the deal that's being struck sounds a lot like what was offered to Tibet in an earlier time. We should be wary. But that was a more fringe kind of thing. It's moved more mainstream in the diaspora anyway.
It's really interesting. And it makes me think too of what you said about the language of return or huigui on that poster versus integration, or sort of different vocabulary.